Welcome to Javel Stories. Please support me by subscribing to my channel. This encourages me to create more interesting stories. Thank you so much as you do so. Timothy Adebanjo's life had been a golden dream, one that others could only envy. As the only child of James and Abigail Adebanjo, he lived in the lap of luxury. Their mansion stood tall and proud in Ibadan, its high gates a marker of success. Inside the house was a haven of beauty and warmth, with polished marble floors, grand chandeliers, and walls adorned with family portraits that seemed to radiate happiness. James was a shrewd businessman whose ventures thrived, earning him admiration and envy in equal measure. Abigail was the heart of the family, a woman whose kindness and philanthropy were renowned across the city. Together, they built not only a home but a legacy of compassion, hosting charity events, building schools, and feeding the poor. For Timothy, life was perfect. He would often follow his mother to her charity events, carrying small baskets of gifts and delighting in the smiles of the children they helped. Timothy, Abigail would say, her voice soft and kind, "God has blessed us so we can bless others. Never forget that." He held on to her words, even though he was too young to fully understand their weight. Christmas in the Adebanjo home was nothing short of magical. Every year they transformed their mansion into a wonderland of lights, music, and laughter. They hosted a grand gala, inviting friends, neighbors, and underprivileged families. Timothy loved these evenings, running around in his fine clothes, surrounded by the warm glow of love and giving. But life, unpredictable and cruel, can shatter even the brightest dreams. It was a rainy December night. The family had just wrapped up their annual Christmas charity gala, and the mood in the car was joyous despite the weather. Abigail hummed softly, her eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of another successful event. James drove carefully, his hands steady on the wheel, while Timothy clutched a small nativity set his mother had gifted him earlier that evening. The rain poured harder and visibility grew worse. Suddenly, a truck, its headlights glaring like twin daggers, appeared from nowhere. James swerved, but the truck was moving too fast. The collision was devastating, the sound of shattering glass and twisting metal deafening. Timothy's last memory before everything went black was his mother's scream, raw and piercing. When Timothy woke in a cold hospital room, the world was silent. The nurse standing by his bedside had a look of pity etched on her face. "I'm sorry, my dear," she said, her voice trembling. "Your parents didn't make it." The words hit him like a physical blow. His father's steady presence, his mother's warm embrace gone. The ache in his chest was unbearable. In the days that followed, Timothy's world crumbled further. Relatives, once warm and doting, turned cold. They looted the Adebanjo estate, selling off assets and stripping the mansion bare. The boy who once had everything was left with nothing but a small suitcase and his nativity set. A week later, Timothy was abandoned at a dilapidated orphanage on the outskirts of town. His pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. The same relatives who had promised to care for him muttered excuses and left without a backward glance. For the first time in his life, Timothy was truly alone. The orphanage was nothing like the home Timothy had known. Perched on the edge of a dusty road, the building loomed like a forgotten relic of the past. Its walls were cracked and stained, its windows grimy and opaque. The air smelled of mildew and despair, a scent that seemed to seep into Timothy's very soul as he crossed the threshold. Mrs. Benson, the matron, greeted him with a cold stare. She was a tall, thin woman with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh. "Follow me," she barked, her tone leaving no room for argument. Timothy obeyed silently, clutching his small suitcase like a lifeline. The room she led him to was small and crowded, with rows of rusted bunk beds crammed together. Thin, tattered mattresses lay atop them, their stuffing spilling out like guts from a wound. A few children glanced at him as he entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. None offered a smile or a kind word. "This is your bed," Mrs. Benson said curtly, pointing to the bottom bunk in the corner. "You'll wake at dawn and work like everyone else. No special treatment, no complaints." Timothy nodded, too numb to respond. Life in the orphanage was harsh. The children were treated more like laborers than wards. They were tasked with endless chores, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and tending to the vegetable garden that provided most of their meals. The food was meager and tasteless, often no more than thin porridge or stale bread. Mrs. Benson hoarded donations meant for the children, selling them for her own profit. Timothy watched in silence as she sorted through a box of clothes one day, setting aside the best items for herself. Among them was a pair of sturdy shoes just the right size for him. His own shoes were falling apart, the soles worn so thin that his feet bled after long days of work. But Mrs. Benson sold the shoes at the market without a second thought. The other children treated Timothy with suspicion and envy. They whispered about his past life of luxury, their words dripping with resentment. To them he was the rich boy, an outsider who didn't belong. Timothy often found himself sitting alone under a mango tree at the edge of the orphanage grounds, staring at the sky and wishing for the warmth of his parents' love. At night, he found solace in the tattered book of Christmas stories his mother had given him. By the dim light of a candle, he would read about miracles and kindness, about a world where love triumphed over hardship. But when he blew out the candle and lay down on the hard mattress, the cold reality of his life pressed down on him like a weight. Christmas was approaching, but for Timothy, it felt like an empty promise. The mornings at the orphanage were as bleak as the building itself. The air was cold, biting at Timothy's skin as he rose from his thin mattress. The other children shuffled around him, their faces hollow and devoid of cheer. Mrs. Benson's sharp voice echoed through the halls, barking orders for the day's chores. Timothy dragged himself to the washroom, where water leaked sluggishly from a rusted faucet. He splashed his face, the icy sting jolting him awake, and looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. His once bright eyes were now dim, his cheeks hollow from weeks of meager meals. The boy staring back at him was a shadow of the child he used to be. The sound of Mrs. Benson's footsteps snapped him from his thoughts. "Timothy," she called, her voice cutting through the quiet morning. He hurried to meet her in the common area, where a box of donated goods sat on the table. "These just arrived from the church," she said, rummaging through the items. Her hands sifted through the contents, pulling out a pair of sturdy shoes, a thick coat, and a few cans of food. Timothy's heart lifted slightly at the sight of the shoes. His current pair, worn thin and riddled with holes, barely protected his feet from the cold. But as quickly as hope sparked, it was extinguished. Mrs. Benson tossed the shoes into a separate pile. "I'll take these to the market," she muttered. "We can't afford to waste good items on you lot." Timothy swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He wanted to speak, to plead for the shoes, but he knew better than to protest. Mrs. Benson's punishments were swift and cruel, and Timothy had learned to endure in silence. Later that day, he sat under a mango tree at the edge of the orphanage grounds. The shade offered little comfort against the December chill, but it was the only place where he could be alone. He stared at his bare feet, the soles rough and blistered from endless work, and felt the sting of tears he couldn't hold back. The tree's branches swayed gently in the wind, their rustling a faint, soothing sound. Timothy's thoughts drifted to his parents. He remembered his father's firm but gentle hand on his shoulder, his mother's warm embrace. He thought of their Christmas traditions, the smell of fresh baked bread filling the house, the sound of carols playing softly in the background, and the glow of candlelight reflecting in the glass ornaments on the tree. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice breaking. He looked up at the sky, his tears blurring the clouds. "I wish someone loved me." As he sat there, a group of children passed by, laughing and playing. For a moment, Timothy felt the ache of loneliness deepen. They didn't include him in their games, their own struggles making them hesitant to open up to anyone new. But even in the midst of his despair, Timothy clung to a faint glimmer of hope. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tattered book of Christmas stories his mother had given him. He opened it to his favorite tale, a story of a poor man who shared his last loaf of bread with a stranger on Christmas Eve, only to find that the stranger was an angel in disguise. As Timothy read, he felt a small warmth bloom in his chest. The story reminded him that even in the darkest times, love and kindness could bring light. One frosty morning, Mrs. Benson sent Timothy to the nearby marketplace to beg for food. He hated these trips. They made him feel smaller and more helpless than ever. The bustling market was alive with activity, vendors shouting their wares, children darting between stalls, and the scent of roasted plantains and spices filling the air. Timothy approached a wealthy merchant standing by a stall overflowing with goods. The man was dressed in fine clothes, his fingers adorned with rings that gleamed in the sunlight. Timothy hesitated, then spoke softly. "Please, sir, could you spare some food?" The merchant turned and looked down at him, his expression twisting with disgust. "Go away, you little beggar," he spat, shoving Timothy aside. The force of the push sent Timothy stumbling into the dirt. Laughter erupted from nearby onlookers, their mocking voices cutting through him like a knife. Humiliated, Timothy sat in the dirt, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He hugged his knees to his chest, wishing he could disappear. But before despair could take hold, a gentle voice broke through the noise. "Are you all right, son?" Timothy looked up to see a man standing before him. He was dressed simply in a worn but clean shirt and trousers, and his eyes were warm with concern. The man crouched down, offering Timothy his hand. "Here," he said, his voice soft. "Take this." In his other hand was a loaf of bread, fresh and fragrant. Timothy stared at it, his stomach growling, but hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The man smiled. "Because you need it," he said simply. "What's your name?" "Timothy," he whispered. "Timothy Adebanjo." The man's expression changed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Adebanjo," he repeated. "I know that name. Your parents," he paused, his gaze softening. "They were good people." Timothy's throat tightened, but he managed a nod. "They're gone now," he said, his voice cracking. The man placed a comforting hand on Timothy's shoulder. "I'm Nathaniel," he said, "and I won't let you stay out here alone. Come with me. Let's get you somewhere warm." Timothy hesitated. The kindness in Nathaniel's eyes was unfamiliar, almost overwhelming. But something about the man's presence felt safe, like a faint echo of the love he had lost. Slowly, Timothy nodded and took Nathaniel's hand. As they walked away from the market, Timothy felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. Perhaps, he thought, not all strangers were cruel. Nathaniel's home was modest but welcoming. It sat at the edge of the marketplace, a small structure with mud walls and a corrugated metal roof. The yard was tidy, with a wooden bench under a mango tree and a small garden where herbs grew in neat rows. As they approached, the scent of something warm and spicy wafted through the air. Inside, Nathaniel's wife, Martha, stood over a pot of soup simmering on a clay stove. She was a kind-looking woman, with soft eyes and a warmth that radiated even before she spoke. She turned when she heard footsteps, and her gaze landed on Timothy. Her face immediately softened. "Who is this, Nathaniel?" she asked, wiping her hand on her apron and walking over. "This is Timothy," Nathaniel replied. "I found him in the marketplace. He needs a meal and a place to rest." Martha knelt in front of Timothy, her gentle hands brushing the dirt from his face. "You poor thing," she said. "Come, sit down. Let me get you something to eat." Timothy hesitated, his hands clutching his tattered book tightly. "I don't want to be a burden," he said softly, his voice barely audible. Martha smiled. "You're not a burden, child. Everyone deserves kindness, especially at Christmas." Timothy's heart tightened at her words, and he let her guide him to the table. Minutes later, a steaming bowl of soup and a plate of bread sat before him. The first bite filled his mouth with warmth, the kind that seemed to seep into his very soul. "Eat as much as you like," Martha encouraged. "There's plenty for everyone." As Timothy ate, Nathaniel sat across from him, watching the boy with quiet concern. He noticed how Timothy's hands shook as he held the spoon, the way his eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone to take the food away. "You don't have to be afraid here, Timothy," Nathaniel said gently. "You're safe with us." For the first time in months, Timothy felt the faint stirrings of trust. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. Later that evening, Nathaniel listened as Timothy recounted his story, the car crash, the loss of his parents, the cruelty of the orphanage. His voice faltered as he spoke of Mrs. Benson, of the shoes she had taken and sold, and of the loneliness that had consumed him. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he listened, his heart breaking for the boy. "No child should have to endure this," he said, his voice firm. "Martha and I will help you, Timothy. You're not alone anymore. Timothy looked at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Why would you help me?" he asked. Nathaniel leaned forward, his expression soft but serious. "Because Christmas is about love, and love means giving, especially when it's hard. Your parents lived by that principle, and now I'll do the same." Timothy nodded slowly, the faintest glimmer of hope sparking in his heart. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he might not have to face it alone. The next morning, Timothy woke to the sound of birds chirping outside Nathaniel's home. For the first time in months, he had slept in a real bed with a blanket to keep him warm. He stretched, his muscles aching from months of hard labor, but there was a sense of peace in his heart that he hadn't felt since his parents' death. Martha greeted him with a smile as he entered the kitchen, handing him a plate of akara and a cup of warm tea. "Eat up, Timothy," she said. "You'll need your strength." Nathaniel joined them at the table, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking, Timothy," he began. "We can't just leave the other children in that orphanage." "It's not right." Timothy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "You want to help them?" Nathaniel nodded. "They deserve a Christmas too, don't they?" "Just like you, but we'll need help to make it happen." Timothy hesitated, the faces of the other orphans flashing in his mind. He thought of their hollow eyes, their rough hands, and their laughter that never reached their hearts. "They need it," he said softly. "Even Mrs. Benson, in her own way, needs to see what love looks like." Nathaniel smiled. "That's the spirit, Timothy." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of preparation. Nathaniel rallied the local church and marketplace vendors, telling them Timothy's story and the plight of the orphanage. At first there was skepticism. Many had heard of Mrs. Benson's greed and were reluctant to contribute. But Nathaniel's earnestness and Timothy's quiet courage melted their doubts. By evening, they had gathered enough donations to bring Christmas to the orphanage. There were sacks of rice, crates of vegetables, second-hand clothes, and even a few toys. Timothy worked tirelessly alongside Nathaniel and Martha, sorting and packing the items. As the sun set, Timothy stood back and looked at the gathered supplies. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that he could make a difference, even in the smallest way. The following morning, they loaded the supplies onto a cart and made their way to the orphanage. Timothy's heart raced as they approached the familiar gates. He wasn't sure how Mrs. Benson would react, but he felt stronger knowing he wasn't alone. Mrs. Benson greeted them with her usual scowl, but Nathaniel stood firm. "We're here to bring Christmas to these children," he said, his voice steady but kind. "It's time they knew what love looks like." For a moment, Mrs. Benson looked as though she might argue. But the sight of the gathered supplies and the determination in Nathaniel's eyes softened her resolve. She stepped aside, allowing them in. As the supplies were unpacked and the orphanage transformed with decorations, Timothy saw something he hadn't seen in months, the children's faces lighting up with joy. The orphanage, which had always felt cold and lifeless, was unrecognizable. Nathaniel and Martha worked tirelessly, stringing up decorations made from colorful paper and dried palm fronds. The children, hesitant at first, eventually joined in, laughing as they hung ornaments on a makeshift Christmas tree. A tall mango branch decorated with ribbons and small baubles from the donations. Timothy couldn't help but smile as he watched the transformation. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, filled with laughter and the scent of jollof rice cooking in large pots outside. Martha had rallied the women from her church to prepare a feast, and the tantalizing aroma of spices wafted through the orphanage, making everyone's mouths water. The children gathered around as Nathaniel began unpacking toys from a large sack. The toys were simple wooden cars, cloth dolls, and handmade puzzles, but to the children they might as well have been treasures. Timothy helped distribute them, his heart swelling with joy as he saw the excitement on their faces. A boy no older than 6 clutched a small carved horse to his chest, his eyes wide with wonder. Even Mrs. Benson, usually stern and aloof, seemed to soften. She stood in the corner, her arms crossed, but her usual scowl was absent. Her eyes lingered on the children, and for a fleeting moment, Timothy thought he saw a flicker of emotion, perhaps regret or longing. As the day went on, the once dull orphanage became a place of joy and celebration. The children played with their toys, danced to music played on an old radio, and ate until their bellies were full. Timothy sat quietly under the mango tree, watching it all unfold. Nathaniel approached him, sitting down beside him. "You've done something incredible, Timothy," he said, his voice warm. Timothy shook his head. "It wasn't me. It was you and Martha and everyone who helped." Nathaniel smiled. "You reminded us why we needed to help. Your parents would be proud of you." The mention of his parents brought a lump to Timothy's throat. He looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to appear as dusk settled. "I miss them," he said softly, "especially now." Nathaniel placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "They're still with you, Timothy. In your heart, in the love you show to others, they're always there." As the evening came to a close, the children gathered around a small fire outside. Nathaniel led them in singing Christmas carols, their voices rising into the cool night air. Timothy sang along, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each verse. For the first time since losing his parents, he felt a sense of peace. The warmth of the fire, the laughter of the children, and the kindness of Nathaniel and Martha reminded him of what his mother had always said: "Christmas is about love." As the celebrations wound down, Nathaniel quietly stepped away, heading into the small storage room where he kept his tools and materials. Among them was a table he had spent months crafting, a beautiful piece of work with intricate carvings and a polished finish. It was meant to be sold for a good price, money that he and Martha had planned to use for repairs to their home. But as he looked at the table, he thought of Timothy and the other children. Their joy that day had been worth more than any material possession. With a heavy heart, Nathaniel decided to sell the table immediately to cover the remaining costs of the orphanage's Christmas celebration. The next morning, Timothy found him sitting by the table, his hands tracing its smooth surface. "What are you doing?" Timothy asked, tilting his head in curiosity. Nathaniel smiled but didn't answer right away. After a moment, he said, "Sometimes we have to give up something important to us to help others." Timothy frowned, his brow furrowing. "But you worked so hard on this. It's beautiful." "It is," Nathaniel agreed. "But the beauty of what we've done for you and the other children, that's worth more than any table." Timothy didn't fully understand, but he felt a deep gratitude well up in his chest. He placed his hand over Nathaniel's. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Later that day, Nathaniel sold the table to a merchant in the marketplace. The money was used to buy more supplies for the orphanage, ensuring that the children would have enough food, clothes, and blankets to last through the season. When Timothy found out, he was overwhelmed with emotion. He had read stories of sacrifice in his mother's Christmas book, but seeing it in action made the lesson more profound. "You gave up something you loved for us," he said to Nathaniel that evening. Nathaniel smiled. "That's what Christmas is about, Timothy. Love isn't just a feeling, it's an action. It's giving even when it costs you." Timothy thought of his parents and how they had lived their lives giving to others. For the first time, he felt that he was truly honoring their memory. Word of the Christmas celebration spread throughout the community. People who had previously turned a blind eye to the orphanage began to take notice. Some offered to donate food and clothes, while others volunteered to help with repairs. The once neglected building began to transform, its walls repainted, its broken windows replaced. Mrs. Benson too seemed to change. Though still stern, she began to soften in her approach. One evening, she called Timothy into her office. "I've been unfair," she admitted, her voice stiff but sincere. "You've shown me that these children deserve better." "I'll try to do better," Timothy nodded, unsure of what to say. Though he didn't fully trust her yet, he could see that the seeds of change had been planted. 1 year later, the orphanage was almost unrecognizable. The walls were painted a bright yellow, the children had proper beds and clothes, and a small library had been added, thanks to donations from the community. Timothy had grown stronger, both physically and emotionally. Under Nathaniel's guidance, he had learned carpentry and spent his days crafting toys for the other orphans. On Christmas Eve, Timothy stood in the courtyard, watching the children decorate a tree. The air was filled with laughter and the smell of freshly baked bread. Nathaniel and Martha stood nearby, their faces glowing with pride. As the carols began, Timothy closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. "Thank you, God, for sending me a family when I thought all was lost." And as he opened his eyes, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as though his parents were watching over him, proud of the boy he had become. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.